I'm interested that in the painting renaissance, if you like, where England doesn't really feature very highly in this, and yet we're with this weird technological modern kind of place, 800 years and all that. Why do you think we were kind of not up with the Italians and the Germans and the Dutch, and when it came to the arts, the visual arts and the use of glass, given our predisposition to be ahead of the game in a lot of things with technology?
Well, it is a great puzzle. I mean, if you look at European civilizations and you look at the high arts, they're distributed very unevenly between countries. Each has its brilliance and then is rather weak in others. It reminds me of my boarding school, you know, where we would be really good at maths but useless at English. And it was the same in the high arts. And basically, if you look at music, 80% of the great musicians are German or Austrian.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some good French, and we have a good German who came over here, Handel. But you know, we're middling. We're not really a great musical power. In painting, you think of the Dutch, and you think of the Italians and the French to a certain extent, later on particularly, and Germans. But the English have a burst in the 18th century with some very good landscape painters and portrait painters, Constable and so on. But it's second rank. The one sort of visual art which the English were the best in the world for a while is architecture, because the medieval cathedrals of England are better and greater and huger and more wonderful than anywhere else in the world. It may sound chauvinistic to say that, but Pevsner and others who write about the European architecture agree that there is really nothing to match you know, York and Ely and Canterbury and so on, even in France. I mean, they have wonderful cathedrals, of course. And again, the stained glass, which is also wonderful in France, is important. But if you'd looked at Europe, say in 1200 or 1300, the top 20 greatest, biggest, most wonderful cathedrals, half of them would have been in England. And there's a period in English architecture, perpendicular, in the 14th, 15th century, where you go straight up and then across. And the most one of the most wonderful examples is my chapel in King's College, Cambridge, which is just a miracle of architecture. And there are a few others. At that moment, English perpendicular architecture was right up with anything else that was happening in Europe. And some of the 18th century architecture is very good too. But basically, the English were not good at painting. I mean, the usual explanation is patronage. Painting is an expensive business, and you need people sort of to be commissioned. So there is a goodish burst of painting in England under Charles I, and who was a good patron. And to a certain extent in 18th century England, when Hanoverians and some rich nabobs and others commissioned painting. So the unequal distribution of wealth in Italy and a lot of commercial wealth in Holland meant that you could have these studios where people were commissioned to do high art. And that explanation might also be part of the background to the other great difference that is in music, because it's in those same courtly, or at least princely, patronage-rich environments that people like Bach and Handel and Mozart and others worked. They were commissioned by wealthy burghers or princes to do the work in a way in which wasn't the case. I mean, Handel had to make his living here largely through selling his performances through actually putting on a performance and then people coming and paying for tickets and so on. He did have some patrons, but it wasn't the same. And so the absence of a patron structure of the same kind may be one of the great differences. Otherwise, the last thing to say about that is that, as I say, each civilization has its great art, and the English great art is not in the plastic arts or the visual arts, but it's in the mental arts, in the imagination. Because if you look at imaginative worlds, particularly in literature, and again, one has to avoid being chauvinistic, but and I know too little to be absolutely certain, but to my mind, putting aside China and to a certain extent certain periods in Russia, which I don't know much about, English poetry produced in England and a little bit in Scotland and Ireland, if you had to put the poetry of the world, a lot of the greatest poetry was written in this country, not just Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, and the Romantics and so on, but really a wonderful tradition of poetry. I mean, there's obviously great poetry in every civilization, but the concentration of poetry here, or again, novels, the English novel from Defoe onwards, is among the great novel traditions of the world. There's obviously great novels everywhere, but we have some of the great novelists, often women, of course. And another one where I think there's no question about the dominance, and that is in children's literature. If you look at, the 30 or 40 greatest books for children, many of them are English or Scottish. Scots were good too. That